By the early 21st century, most Egyptologists had come to agree with Howard Carter's belief that Tutankhamun was biologically connected to his immediate royal predecessors. He was likely the final ruler of Egypt's 18th dynasty, who descended from the line that began with Thutmose I to date. No genetic link has been discovered between Thutmose I and Ahmose, the founder of the New Kingdom. Ahmose's victory over Kamudi ended the rule of the Hyksos, foreign rulers from the Levant who had controlled parts of Egypt for nearly a century, beginning around 1480 BC, when Thutmose II succeeded Thutmose I, the throne generally passed. From father to son, though, in one notable case, it passed to a daughter, Queen Hatshepsut. This pattern continued through the reign of Amenhotep IV. Amenhotep IV, who later changed his name to Akhenaten to honor the solar deity Aten, was one of the children born to Amenhotep III and his chief wife, Queen Tai. Despite this lineage, the exact family ties between Akhenaten and those who followed him on the throne remain a matter of debate. Recent analyses of royal mummies by teams of scientists, radiologists, and pathologists have failed to provide conclusive answers. Some scholars argue that Akhenaten was the father of Prince Tutankhamun, while others claim the prince was the son of Smenkhare, whose own identity remains unclear. Was Smenkhare Akhenaten's son, his brother, or possibly both co-regent and successor? The debate extends further, with experts also divided over the identity of Tutankhamun's mother. The artifact known as the Hermopolis block has been central to debates about Tutankhamun's lineage. Composed of two adjoining fragments decorated on both sides, the block was discovered in the 1930s by a German expedition from Hildesheim during excavations at Ashmanin, the ancient city of Hermopolis. It is one of several hundred relief-carved blocks found at the site that originally adorned the walls of Akhenaten's buildings in Tel El Amarna, the capital he established on the east bank of the Nile, farther upstream, during the reign of Horemheb. Second successor. The temples and palaces of Tel El Amarna were dismantled, and their building materials were transported to Hermopolis for reuse. Later, under the rule of Ramesses II, the very structures built by Horemheb at Hermopolis were themselves taken apart, and the blocks were repurposed yet again, this time in the construction of a temple gateway. The reliefs and inscriptions on the Tel El Amarna blocks recovered at Hermopolis endured various forms of intentional defacement and accidental damage throughout their history. By the time the block related to Tutankhamun's parentage was found, it had already been broken into two separate pieces. For years, scholars investigating Tutankhamun's family tree failed to notice that the original excavator had connected the two fragments in his report. In 1997, Jacobus van Dyck brought attention back to the block by publishing a drawing of the inscription, followed a few years later by another rendering from Mark Gaboldi. Both researchers had relied on photographs from the excavation report, as the actual fragments had been misplaced. In 2008, Zahi Hawass, then chairman of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, announced in his Dig Days column in Al-Arom Weekly that the block had been rediscovered in a storage facility at Ashmanin. In 2013, he published a striking photograph of the inscribed side in his seventh book on Tutankhamun. W. Raymond Johnson's reconstruction of the reverse side of the Hermopolis block reveals a decorative column capital adorned with a garland that includes ducks hanging upside down by their feet. In the tombs of non-royal individuals at Amarna, similar columns are depicted supporting the roofs of pavilions that house the royal family. However, it is the other side of the block featuring 6 vertical columns of inscription that has captured the attention of Egyptologists. The text is symmetrically arranged, but not perfectly centered. More of the third column on the right survives than its counterpart on the left. The inscription on the right reads, "King's son of his body, whom he loves, Tutankhamun." Partially preserved final hieroglyph, which shows a squatting man, confirms that the individual mentioned is male. This is currently the only known instance of the name given to the boy, whether as prince or king, with definitive origins from Tel El Amarna. The left-hand inscription begins similarly with king's daughter of his body and continues whom he loves, one greatly favored by the Lord of the Two Lands, referring to the king. Unfortunately, the girl's name has been lost, except for the reed leaf at the bottom of the final column on the left, which is part of the word Aten. Van Dyck and Gaboldi follow the conclusion of the original German excavator, who believed the princess mentioned was Ankhesenpotan, the third eldest daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. However, it remains possible that the girl could be one of the couple's 3 other daughters, all of whom had names incorporating the sun god Aten. In roughly a third of known examples of the name Maketaten, the second oldest daughter, the element Aten appears at the end. Still, she likely died before the inscription naming Prince Tutankhamun was created. Nefertiti Jr., the fourth daughter, is rarely mentioned in records, and her name like that of the eldest daughter. Meritant always begins with the Aten component. Ankhesenpotan is the only daughter whose name regularly ends with Aten, making her the most likely candidate for the princess identified in the inscription. Gaboldi argues that the inscription on the Hermopolis block proves Prince Tut shared both his mother and father with at least one sister. He suggests these parents were Akhenaten and Nefertiti, based on the assumption that children of different royal wives were not typically portrayed together on official monuments. While the limited evidence from Tel El Amarna seems to support this idea, Gaboldi himself has previously made a case for an exception. In the tomb of Huyetha, steward of Queen Tai, Akhenaten's mother 2 scenes show Akhenaten and Nefertiti with 2 daughters seated opposite Tai, who is accompanied by a princess named Bek. Some Egyptologists, including myself, agree with the view first proposed over a century ago by Norman de Garis Davies, that Bakhtiten was the daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai, and therefore Akhenaten's sister. Boldi, however, identifies Bakhteten as the daughter of Kia Akhenaten's lesser-known wife. Reliefs confirm that Kia had a daughter, as she is depicted with a child, though the girl's name has not survived. If Gabold's reading of the Huya tomb scene is accepted, then his interpretation of the Hermopolis block becomes less compelling. In that case, Tutankhamun could just as well have been Akhenaten's son by another consort, not necessarily Nefertiti. The traditional understanding of the Huya tomb scenes supports the idea that the king referred to in Bek's title, King's Daughter, was not the same as the king mentioned in the titles of the daughters, shown with Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Similarly, the title King's Great Wife used for Nefertiti does not refer to the same king as the one in Tai's title within the same scene. Asterisk, asterisk, the absence of Tutankhamun from the numerous depictions of Akhenaten and Nefertiti with their daughters does not invalidate the theory that Nefertiti was his mother. Supporters of this view rightly note that artistic conventions at Tel El Amarna generally excluded male children from family signs, a pattern that continued until the 19th dynasty. Nevertheless, Gaboldi suggests that Tutankhamun is not completely missing from such depictions. He identifies a baby shown in a woman's arms in the reliefs within Akhenaten's tomb in the royal wadi at Amarna as the prince. These scenes appear on the walls of chambers Alpha and Gamma 3 side, rooms branching off the stairwell leading to the tomb's pillared hall where Akhenaten was buried. In total, 3 scenes 2 in chamber Alpha depict Akhenaten and Nefertiti mourning over a deceased woman. They stand by the bed on which the body rests. In 2 of the scenes, a group showing a woman holding an infant appears just outside the room, turned away from the scene of mourning. In ancient times, only the group in chamber Gamma had an accompanying label, but even more of that inscription has since been lost compared to when a French Egyptologist copied it in the late 19th century. Scholars continue to debate the text's original reference, whether it named the woman or the infant, as well as the identities and even the gender of the figures shown. Asterisk, asterisk, the suggestion that the baby shown in the reliefs is Tutankhamun was not originally proposed by Gaboldi. Earlier scholars had identified the deceased woman mourned by Akhenaten and Nefertiti in chamber Gamma as Princess Maketaten based on the accompanying inscription, or suggested that Kia might be the unnamed woman in chamber Alpha. Interpretations, either Maketaten or Kia was assumed to be the child's mother rather than Nefertiti. Van Dyck rejected both of these views, proposing instead that the infant in the arms of the nurse was Maketaten herself, reborn in the afterlife, idea that Jeffrey T. Martin has, in my opinion, successfully refuted. Van Dyck also put forward the theory that the proximity of the princes' and princesses' names on the Hermopolis block strongly indicates that the 2 royal children were married at the time the inscriptions were carved. The princess's title, one greatly favored by the Lord of the Two Lands, supports the idea that she held an especially privileged position. This particular title is unique to the Hermopolis block. In the entire 18th dynasty, only 2 other women are known to have held a comparable title. Sataman, Akhenaten's sister, was described as favored but not greatly favored by her father, Amenhotep III, and Nefertiti's wet nurse and wife of Ai. Tutankhamun's successor was called greatly favored by Wenra, another name for Akhenaten, as Tutankhatun's wife, Ankhesenpatan, was described as great of favors, a designation she retained even after her name was changed to Ankhesenamun. This title had earlier been borne by her grandmother Tai, principal wife of Amenhotep III. However, the exact timing of her marriage to Tutankhamun, it may have taken place only after he ascended the throne, not necessarily to legitimize his claim, as is often suggested, but rather to ensure the continued status of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's daughter during the political and religious restoration period. In truth, very little is known about royal marriages in ancient Egypt, beyond references to the exchange of gifts in diplomatic contexts. Among commoners, marriage likely did not involve formal rituals or ceremonies. The title wife simply indicated a woman's marital status, though how or when she officially received it is unclear. Regarding Tutankhatun's parentage, Van Dyck considers earlier suggestions that he was the son of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai to be unlikely. He also rules out Nefertiti as his mother, since monuments depict her only with daughters. Kia, Akhenaten's other known wife, is occasionally shown with a daughter but never with a son. Although Van Dyck uses this absence to argue against Nefertiti's maternity, he stops short of ruling out Kia entirely. He speculates that Kia's disappearance from the historical record might coincide with the birth of Tutankhaten and could have resulted from her having produced a male Iran event that may have threatened Nefertiti's position at court. Dodson, while acknowledging the merit of Van Dyck's interpretation of the royal tomb scene, maintains his belief that Tutankhaten was the son of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. He interprets the inscription on the Hermopolis block as labels identifying figures of Ankhesenpatan and Tutankhaten in a double scene showing Akhenaten and Nefertiti worshipping the Aten, each accompanied by their children on either side. It's likely that the names on the block did indeed label specific figures. However, the layout of the hieroglyphs in 2 vertical columns facing one another does not align with Dodson's reconstruction. In scenes from Amarna showing Ak and Nefertiti worshipping the Aten, the 2 are never shown facing each other, as Dodson's version would require. Instead, when their daughters are present in such scenes, they are always positioned behind Nefertiti, who follows behind Akhenaten, James. P. Allen has offered a more ambiguous suggestion for the original setting of the Hermopolis block, that the prince and princess were part of a scene depicting some form of close interaction, suggesting their association and, possibly even a marriage prior to Tutankhatun's rise to kingship. There is ample evidence that large-scale images of Akhenaten and his family once decorated temples and palaces in Amarna based on blocks discovered at Hermopolis. 2 such blocks, one housed in Brooklyn and another in Cairo, show Nefertiti kissing a princess. In similar family scenes found on stele and in non-royal tombs at Amarna, the orientation of the children's bodies, rather than their heads, typically determines the direction of the identifying captions. If this convention also applies to the Hermopolis block, it would mean the prince and princess were depicted facing one another. Even if their heads were turned back toward a parent, the relatively large size of the hieroglyphs implies that the associated figures were also rendered on a grand scale. In many inscriptions from Amarna that mention the daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, the texts end with the phrase, "born of the king's great wife, Nefertiti, may she live forever." If the Hermopolis inscriptions had continued with a similar phrase, it would have created considerable spacing between the figures. Regardless of their role or position within the scene, it's also possible that the prince and princess were shown, together without any other family members, facing one another in a pose reminiscent of the imagery found on the small golden shrine from Tutankhamun's tomb, object No. 108. However, that shrine was created not only after Tutankhaten had become king, but also after both his and his queen's names had been changed to honor Amun. In the end, the only firm conclusion the Hermopolis block offers is that both the prince and the princess were children of a king, though not necessarily the same king. *** Between September 2007 and October 2009, a team of Egyptian and German specialists, led by Zahi Hawass, conducted CT scans on several royal mummies and extracted DNA samples for genetic analysis. One of the main goals of this project was to apply advanced scientific methods to better understand the familial relationships within Akhenaten's lineage. Another key objective was to investigate the cause of Tutankhamun's death, which is addressed separately in Chapter 7. The findings were announced in a press release by the Supreme Council of Antiquities on February 17, 2010, and simultaneously published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA. The announcement quickly sparked controversy. Dennis Forbes, editor of KMT, a modern journal of ancient Egypt, was among the first non-medical experts to raise concerns. He noted inconsistencies between the press release and the JAMA article, especially the contrast between the confident tone of the former and the more cautious language of the latter. Despite these differences in presentation, both sources affirmed that Akhenaten was the father of Tutankhamun, before diving into the details of the study's conclusions. It's important to recognize that recent research has questioned the reliability and application of DNA testing, even in modern forensic investigations. With that caution in mind, the results reported by Hawass's team indicated that Tutankhamun was the biological son of the individual buried in tomb KV55, a small single-chamber tomb located near Tutankhamun's own burial site, KV62. The genetic evidence also linked this individual to the so-called Elder Lady, a mummy identified as Queen Tai. This identification was made possible by the earlier discovery of Tai's parents in tomb KV46. Additionally, the tests showed that the KV55 individual was also related to the mummy known as Amenhotep III. Both Queen Tai and Amenhotep III had been found together in KV35, the tomb of Amenhotep II, where they had been reburied in antiquity. However, a major question remains. Are the remains in KV55 truly those of Akhenaten? What if Tai and Amenhotep III had more than two sons Akhenaten, and another, in addition to the well-documented crown prince Thutmose? If so, the man in KV55 might not be Akhenaten at all. The ownership of the KV55 coffin and the identity of the individual whose remains were found within it remain subjects of intense debate among scholars specializing in the Amarna period. The anthropoid coffin plate I shows the deceased wearing what is commonly called the Nubian, or pointed wig, crafted from multiple layers of tightly curled corkscrew-like locks. Whether the royal uraeus on the forehead and the plated curled beard, a symbol of divinity at the chin, were part of the coffin's original design or added later, is still disputed. The coffin's feathered inlay pattern, which decorates the entire body, follows the stylistic conventions of royal New Kingdom coffins. A similar design appears on the outer coffin of Queen Nefertiti, the mother of Amenhotep. The position of the arms, crossed over the chest, was used for both male and female burials. When KV55 was first opened, the objects once held in the coffin's hands were missing. These could have included a pharaoh's crook and flail ankh symbols, or papyrus, scepters depending on the gender and rank of the individual. 15 years ago, Alfred Grimm proposed that the coffin was originally crafted for Akhenaten during the early years of his reign. According to his interpretation, the coffin later became obsolete and was ultimately reused for his successor Smenkhkare. Prior to Grimm's theory, the widely accepted view among scholars was that the coffin, like the canopic jars found in the same tomb, had been originally made for Kia, Akhenaten's lesser wife, and then modified for Akhenaten himself. Grimm's explanation for the coffin's design, claiming it was originally intended for Akhenaten, is ultimately unconvincing. The Nubian wig featured on the coffin, which also appears on the lids of the associated canopic jars, is a hairstyle strongly linked to just one individual from the Amarna period, Kia. Although there are a few known depictions of Akhenaten wearing this type of wig, none are appropriate comparisons for a royal burial, nor do they date to the early part of his reign, which is when Grimm suggests the coffin was produced. Moreover, Grimm appears to have misunderstood the nature of the modifications made to the coffin's inscriptions. These alterations resemble those made to the small canopic coffinets that were repurposed for Tutankhamun, originally part of the burial equipment of a ruling queen who reigned just before him. The inlaid hieroglyphic bands running down the front of the lid and along the upper edge of the coffin's basin once bore the name of the original owner. These were fully replaced with new inscriptions, naming Akhenaten. Meanwhile, the text at the base of the coffin, executed in the chased gold sheeting technique, was physically altered by patching. These revisions likely occurred when Akhenaten's body was relocated from the royal tomb at Amarna in preparation for reburial in the Valley of the Kings at western Thebes. The precision with which Akhenaten's cartouches were later removed indicates an effort to substitute his name with another, rather than to vandalize the inscription. Notably, Akhenaten's honorifics, such as perfect little child of Aton and great in his lifetime, were left intact, suggesting that these epithets were deemed appropriate for the new owner. Similarly, the title perfect ruler inscribed down the lid of the coffin, a replacement for the older royal title perfect god, introduced by Akhenaten around his 12th regnal year, continued to be used for some time even after Tutankhamun had taken the throne. Even if the question of who the KV-55 coffin was originally made for could one day be definitively answered, uncertainty would still remain about the identity of the individual who is actually buried in it, since the inscriptions were in the process of being modified to reflect a new owner. Before the Egyptian-German team released their findings, some Egyptologists believed that those who placed the coffin in KV-55 intended it for Akhenaten. Others were convinced that the remains were indeed his, while still others identified the deceased as Akhenaten's male successor, or perhaps co-regent Menkaure, who may have been either his son or his brother. The conclusions drawn by the Egyptian-German team regarding the KV-55 remains have also been inconclusive, partly due to internal disagreements that became public when a television documentary promoting the project aired. So far, the evidence supporting the team's claim that the deceased was between 35 and 45 years old at the time of death has not been published. Instead, the authors of the accompanying medical article simply stated, "The mummy in KV-55 was previously thought to have died in his 20s. However, our new CT scan suggests that he lived to be much older." If the individual did die between the ages of 35 and 45, that would suggest Akhenaten was between 18 and 28 years old when he came to the throne, a plausible range. Considering the events of his 17-year reign and the likely ages at which he fathered his children, including the presumed son, Tutankhamun, still this age estimate is higher than those previously proposed by other experts. The most generous, earlier estimate, placing the age at death between 30 and 35, was made in 1992 based on a reassessment of biological evidence. However, just like the age estimate in the recent study, that data has never been made publicly available for peer review. Other specialists who have examined the KV-55 remains, beginning with G. Elliott Smith in the early 20th century and continuing through 2 studies conducted in 2000, have generally estimated the age at death to be between 18 and 25. Such a young age is difficult, if not impossible, to reconcile with the scale of reforms and innovations carried out during the early years of Akhenaten's reign. As has previously been pointed out, shortly after the JAMA article was released, Eugene Strohol published findings from his 1998 examination of the KV-55 remains. He concluded that the male individual died at an age between 19 and 22 years, an estimate consistent with the earlier assessment made by R.G. Harrison nearly 45 years earlier. Physical anthropologist Corinne Duhigg, writing in the same publication as Strohol, supported this age range. While Duhigg refrained from speculating on the individual's identity, Strohol confidently identified the remains as those of Menkaure, whom he regarded as Tutankhamun's elder brother. However, none of these experts directly address a fundamental problem with aging ancient remains: the absence of a reliable pool of well-dated contemporaneous bodies for comparison. Aidan Dodson has highlighted this issue, noting significant inconsistencies between the age-at-death assessments made by physical anthropologists and the actual recorded ages found on coffins from 18th and 19th century crypts at Christ Church, Spitalfields in London. In some cases, older individuals were assessed as younger, and in others, the age of younger individuals was overestimated. According to the Egyptian-German team, the mummy, known as the Younger Lady, found alongside Amenhotep III and the Elder Lady in the tomb of Amenhotep II, long after the 18th dynasty had ended, was the mother of Prince Tutankhamun and also the sister of the man buried in KV 55. If this sibling relationship is correct, then she too must have been a child of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai. Nevertheless, the team avoided linking her to any of the couple's known daughters by name. Could Nefertiti, who remains the favored candidate of both Dodson and Gaboldi to be Tutankhamun's mother, be identified as the Younger Lady? The names of Nefertiti's sister and nurse are documented, but not those of her parents. This absence of parental identification contrasts sharply with the frequent references to Queen Tai's lineage. Yet it is Tai's case that is unusual, not Nefertiti's. It is possible that one of Amenhotep III's daughters adopted the name Nefertiti upon marrying Akhenaten. Still, if Nefertiti were indeed a daughter of Amenhotep III and thus a sister to Akhenaten or Smenkhare, the absence of titles such as King's Daughter or King's Sister from her formal titles would be striking, especially considering how thoroughly her presence is documented. Alternative readings of the DNA data have been put forward by Swiss Egyptologist Hermann Schlegel and later by Mark Gaboldi, each offering a different interpretation of Tutankhamun's family tree based on the genetic markers published by Howiss's team. Working with a geneticist and a biotechnician, Schlegel begins by identifying the mummy found in the tomb of Amenhotep, labeled by a scribe around 1060 BC as 3As actually belonging to King I Tutankhamun's successor. He also adopts Joanne Fletcher's identification of the Younger Lady, also from the KV35 cache, and genetically identified as the daughter of the man Schlegel believes is Ayaz Nefertiti. G. Elliott Smith, the first scholar to examine the Younger Lady's remains shortly after their discovery, judged the damage to her face and chest as post-mortem. This view was widely accepted until challenged by Hawass and his team, who concluded that the injuries were fatal. Schlegel accepts their view and attributes Nefertiti's death to a horrific chariot accident around year 14 of Akhenaten's reign, which he argues caused widespread mourning in Egypt. However, this theory overlooks evidence indicating that Nefertiti was still alive into year 16 of Akhenaten's reign. Schlegel also disputes the identification of the Elder Lady from KV35, offered by Howiss's team. Instead, he suggests she was a woman named Tamwaji, known from an inscription on an imitation stone vessel found in the tomb of Queen Tai's parents, where her name is accompanied by a single title. According to Schlegel, she was another daughter of that couple and therefore Queen Tai's sister. For the Elder Lady to be A's wife and the mother of the Younger Lady whom Schlegel believes to be Nefertiti, he argues she must have changed her name from Tamwaji to T, which is the name shown for A's wife in both his earlier non-royal tomb at Amarna and in his royal tomb, KV23, at Thebes. Since DNA testing shows that the mummy Schlegel identifies as King I and the Elder Lady he believes to be A's wife were the parents of the person buried in KV55, the body cannot be Akhenaten. Instead, Schlegel identifies the KV55 mummy as Smenkhare, the son of I and Tamwaji. He proposes that Smenkhare's marriage to Merititan Akhenaten's eldest daughter legitimized his ascent to the throne. Under this theory, the mummy of Akhenaten, considered by Schlegel to be the father of Tutankhaten, has not yet been found or was not among those examined by Howiss's team. Despite the detailed argument, Schlegel's proposed genealogy and his reconstruction of events during the final years of Akhenaten's reign remain unconvincing in contrast. Mark Gabold's interpretation of the DNA markers presents a more compelling case. He begins by offering convincing reasons to accept the identification of the mummy from KV35 as Amenhotep III, and supports the idea that the Elder Lady is indeed Queen Tai. He also criticizes Howiss's team for overlooking genetic similarities between the KV35 king's DNA and that of Yu Tai's father, suggesting instead that Amenhotep III and Tai may have been cousins, combining archaeological findings with the genetic data. Gaboldi raises the possibility that one of the female mummies from KV-21, specifically KV-21A, which House's team tentatively identified as Ankhesenemkud, actually be Mutemwaya, the mother of Amenhotep III and wife of Thutmose IV. He also questions whether the DNA data conclusively prove that the younger lady was Akhenaten's full sister. According to his theory, she might instead have been his cousin, and possibly even Nefertiti, especially in light of the royal family's known pattern of close-kin marriages in the later 18th dynasty, as well as the tradition of endogamy, seen within the prominent Akhman family. Yet a persistent issue in Gaboldi's theory is the age at death of the KV-55 individual. He proposes an age range of 27 to 30, which would mean that Akhenaten was only around 10 years old when he ascended the throne. A scenario that seems highly unlikely. Finally, a word should be said about Tutankhamun's mother. Her absence from the historical and archaeological record is striking, particularly given how young he was when he became king. This stands in sharp contrast to the prominent roles that other queen mothers played during their sons' reigns in the late 18th dynasties, such as Tia under Thutmose IV, Mutemwia under Amenhotep III, and Tai under Akhenaten. There are no known reliefs, statues, or inscriptions that honor the woman who gave birth to Tutankhaten. Nor is her name mentioned among any of the artifacts found in his tomb. Whoever she was, the most likely explanation is that she died before he took the throne. The idea that Tutankhamun was born at Tel El Amarna, raised by a wet nurse during infancy, and educated there under the guidance of a tutor, is certainly plausible. However, no concrete evidence currently supports this assumption. The inscription naming him on the Hermopolis block does confirm that he was represented in scenes depicting the royal family at Akhenaten's capital. Given this, it's understandable that Mark Gaboldi would interpret a smaller male figure seated on the lap of a larger, seemingly male individuals, shown on another reused Amarna block at Hermopolis as Tutankhaten. Additional representations of the prince, either in figures or inscriptions, may one day come to light through future excavations or re-evaluation of existing photographic archives. For now, though, other claims regarding further depictions of the prince remain unproven. One such claim involves a relief fragment of unknown origin now held in a private Swiss collection, which allegedly refers to a sunshade belonging to Prince Tutankhaten. Sunshades were shrine-like structures dedicated to solar worship, typically located within garden enclosures and pools. At Tel El Amarna, these precincts are associated solely with royal women. Not only have the hieroglyphs on this fragment been misread, but there are also legitimate concerns about its authenticity. Another proposed identification comes from Lila Pinchbrock, who suggested that Tutankhaten is the smaller figure in a painted fragment from the king's house in the central city. However, one specific iconographic detail argues against this interpretation. The smaller figure's feet shown next to a larger individual whose feet rest on a patterned cushion drawn in the traditional Egyptian style dating back to the Old Kingdom. Both feet are depicted from an inner angle with no toes visible. On the near foot, in contrast, during the Amarna period, members of the royal family were consistently depicted with toes, shown on the near futa, detail visible in numerous scenes of the king, queen, and princesses in fragments from the same painting now housed in the Ashmolean Museum. Since the smaller figure lacks this distinctive Amarna foot, it is more likely to represent an official or servant attending the royal family, rather than Tutankhaten himself. Throughout Egyptian history, the roles of wet nurse and tutor, two royal children, were undoubtedly significant, and during the 18th dynasty, individuals in these positions began to emerge more clearly in the historical record. One of the most notable examples from the New Kingdom is Senemet, who served as tutor to Queen Hatshepsut's daughter, Neferyur. Several statues still survive that portray him with the young princess in his care. Other royal tutors were also commemorated in their tombs, often shown with the royal children they instructed. While wet nurses appeared in tombs belonging to their husbands or sons, Nefertiti's own wet nurse is a well-documented figure. She was Ti, the wife of Ai, who would later succeed Tutankhamun on the throne. In the tomb she shared with Ai at Amarna, Ti is frequently shown with inscriptions emphasizing her role as a nurse. During Akhenaten's reign, royal wet nurses appeared for the first time in official royal reliefs. One such example, discovered by the Egypt Exploration Society in the Great Palace at Amarna preserves part of a scene depicting a princess breastfeeding from a wet nurse. 2 additional reliefs of royal nurses were found among reused blocks at Hermopolis. One of them has been reconstructed to show a princess placing a special necklace symbolizing royal favor around her nurse's neck. In late 1996, a French archaeological team led by Aling Zivi uncovered the tomb of Maya, Tutankhamun's wet nurse, in the Saqqara necropolis near Memphis. This tomb had been carved into a cliffside area where, years earlier, the same team had discovered the tomb of Vizier Aparel, or Apiria, who had served under both Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. Apiria's list of titles includes tutor of the royal children, though no depiction of him with his students survives in his tomb's decoration. In contrast, Maya's tomb features a scene in the first chamber showing the young king seated on her lap. He is unmistakably depicted as pharaoh, wearing the blue crown, and the inscriptions identify him as Tutankhamun rather than Tutankhaten. This not only places the tomb after his rise to the throne, but also after the official change of his name. ***, the artistic style of reliefs deeper in the tomb indicates that work may have continued even after Tutankhamun's death. Mark Gaboldi has proposed that the scene of the king on Maha's lap was modified posthumously. In the original version, Maya was shown holding a flower to the boy king's nose, but her hand was later recarved to display a raised gesture of homage. However, this theory, along with Gabold's more tentative idea that Maya might be the wet nurse portrayed in the royal tomb at Amarna, lacks strong support. It is just as likely that Maha's hand was altered immediately after the initial carving to match the homage gesture shown by the male figures behind her, all of whom raise one hand in a similar pose. A sculpture showing a nurse squatting with a young boy seated on her lap, plate 3, has been tentatively identified as Maya. This statue was discovered in a secondary context. During excavations by the Egypt Exploration Society at the Sacred Animal Complex in North Saqqara, the child's feet rest on a small footstool decorated with images of bound foreign captives in a submissive pose, symbolizing royal power. He also wears a pendant featuring a winged scarab, another mark of kingship. The inscription once carved along the base of the statue has been mostly destroyed, likely when the piece was modified to fit a new base, probably during the late period, before it was placed in the Sacred Animal Complex. While the names of both the child and the nurse have been lost, the title of the woman remains legible. She is described not merely as a wet nurse, but as the great wet nurse of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. This title does not appear in the extensive inscriptions found in Maya's tomb, raising doubts about whether the woman depicted is truly Mayan. Additionally, the statue's now missing inlaid eyes indicate the high status of the figure. However, the boy does not resemble known representations of Tutankhamun, and certain stylistic details, like the rosettes on the nurse's breasts, suggest the piece may predate the Amarna period. Aling Zivi has noted the significance of Maya having a tomb of her own, particularly one larger than that of the Vizier Apiria. If Tutankhamun's mother had passed away during his infancy, his wet nurse may have had a significant role in his early upbringing, potentially explaining the elevated status she later attained following his accession to the throne. Another figure who may have influenced the prince's upbringing is a man whose titles included overseer of tutors. Like Maya, he is known only through his tomb, which was uncovered at Akhmim by a team from the Australian Centre for Egyptology. At Macquarie University, led by Boyo Okinga, excavation and documentation were completed in 1990. The presence of clearly preserved cartouches of King Tutankhamun throughout the tomb's decoration confirms it dates to his reign. On the tomb's facade, a chariot scene depicts a second man riding alongside the king, who is shown holding the reins himself. Okinga observes that it is highly unusual to see anyone besides the queen depicted riding in the royal chariot with the king. Although textual sources mention that a driver would accompany the pharaoh during military campaigns or hunts, artistic representations typically maintain the illusion of the king riding alone. There is one potential exception to this convention: a small fragment of a limestone relief from Amarna, now housed in the Brooklyn Museum. James F. Romano wrote 2 studies on this piece, interpreting a rounded form in front of a youthful archer. he believed to be Prince Tutankhamun, the bent-over figure of a chariot driver. This interpretation is plausible, especially since the archer lacks reins tied around his waist, which would typically indicate he was controlling the horses. Himself, however, Romano also reconstructed the image with the youth wearing a fillet that may have once held a uraeus. If this was indeed the case, the figure must have been a king, not a prince. Since during Akhenaten's reign, the uraeus was reserved for the pharaoh and his queen. The small size of the relief, just 5 centimeters in height, suggests it likely adorned a private stela commissioned by a non-royal individual rather than a wall in a temple or palace. Other similar stelae from Amarna featured deities rather than the king. Whether the archer depicted as King Tutankhamun, later Tutankhamun, or possibly the god Shed, who appears on 2 other stelae from the site, remains uncertain. In the chariot seen on the facade of the Akhmim tomb, the man riding with the king is not the driver, but serves as his fanbearer, while the pharaoh's cartouches are only partially preserved. The name of the fanbearer appears never to have been inscribed. The king is most likely Tutankhamun. Okinga suggests that the fanbearer is not the tomb's owner, as might be assumed, but instead a husband of Nefertiti's wet nurse, like Queen Akhenaten's mother. I came from Akhmim, and his ties to the city are confirmed by a temple he commissioned thereafter taking the throne. Okinga considers it very likely that I and the tomb's owner were related, even if the exact nature of their connection remains unclear. As mentioned earlier, Gaboldi also argues that the royal family had close links to a clan based in Akhmim. However, despite these associations, there is no concrete evidence that Prince Tutankhaten spent part of his childhood in or near Akhmim. ****. The sequence of events following Akhenaten's death remains a highly debated topic among scholars. However, there is now general agreement that a woman assumed the throne, albeit briefly, between Akhenaten's passing and the rise of Tutankhaten. Thanks to Mark Gabold's research, it is known that this woman adopted the throne name Ankh, beloved of Wenra Akhenaten, and referred to herself as Neferneferuaten, beneficial for her husband. The identity of this queen, as well as the identity of the husband she referenced, remains uncertain. Aidan Dodson, revising his earlier theories about the final years of Akhenaten's reign and his death, proposed in 2009 that the woman in question was Nefertiti. According to this view, she ruled alongside Akhenaten as co-regent after the death of his earlier male co-regent Smenkhare. Upon Akhenaten's death, Nefertiti then acted as regent for their son, Tutankhaten. Other Egyptologists argue instead that the queen who ruled was Meritaten, Akhenaten's eldest daughter and possibly also his wife, or the wife and sister of Smenkhare. James Allen suggests another daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti for Neferuaten, Jr., the fourth-born as the ruling queen, positing that she married Smenkhare, who was later succeeded by Tutankhamun, adding further complexity to the issue. Some Egyptologists, including the author of this summary, and historians specializing in the Hittite Empire, believe the woman who ruled Egypt just before Tutankhaten's accession was the unnamed queen who appears in later Hittite records. This queen sent a letter to King Shupoluliuma of Hatti, requesting that one of his sons be sent to Egypt to become her husband and king. Debate continues over the identity of this queen. Was she Nefertiti or Meritaten, fate of the Hittite prince, who was either killed en route to Egypt or after his arrival? Still, another theory identifies the widow as Ankhesenomon and dates the episode to roughly a decade later. After the death of Tutankhamun, it must be acknowledged that none of the current reconstructions of events immediately before Tutankhaten's accession or following Tutankhamun's death can be fully reconciled with all existing evidence. Since the interpretations rely largely on individual conviction, and both Hittite and Egyptian scholars offer compelling arguments, it would serve little purpose to attempt a full review of all the conflicting viewpoints here. There is no direct evidence that Tutankhamun was crowned at Thebes, unlike his second successor Horemheb, who later claimed to have been crowned there roughly 15 years afterward. Nor is there a clear alternative location identified for the young prince's coronation. In general, Egyptian texts often refer simply to the emergence of a new king on the throne, without specifying the location or details of the ceremony. In temple scenes from both earlier and later periods, The coronation of a pharaoh is typically depicted with deities officiating. Standing beside the enthroned ruler who wears the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, it is assumed that at this symbolic moment, the king would receive the crook and flail, the traditional insignia of royal power since the Old Kingdom. Among the objects recovered from Tutankhamun's tomb, one of the flails and one of the crooks are notably small, child-sized in scale. The crooks to end caps bear his throne name, Nebkipper, flanked by upright cobras, while the base of the flail features both his personal name Tutankhaten and his throne name. Their similar design, size, materials, and craftsmanship suggest that this set may have been specially created for the boy king's accession. In 2001, Nozomu Kawai discovered the upper portion of a limestone stela in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo that appears to reference a royal accession. At the top of the stela, beneath a winged sun disk, the goddess Isis is shown nursing a smaller-scale king in the presence of a ithyphallic form of Ammon, identified as Minamannri. Behind this figure, at the far left of the scenes, Lunet, a patch of lettuce sauce symbol associated with Menez, also depicted on the right side of the stela. The gods Ammon and Mut are shown welcoming the king, with Mut offering palm ribs marked with notches, a traditional symbol of long and enduring reign. Scene. Asterisk the king in this relief wears the Hemham crownen ornate headdress adorned with uraei, which is also seen on depictions of Tutankhamun in reliefs from the colonnade hall at Luxor Temple and on the backrest of his golden throne, although the surface of the stela is heavily damaged. Especially the faces of the figures and the cartouches bearing the king's name are no longer legible. The carving style suggests it was created after the Amarna period, Kawai suggested. That faint traces beneath the winged sun disk point to the throne name Nebkipper, linking the piece to Tutankhaten, later Tutankhamun. The lower half of the stela is missing, along with any inscriptions that might have identified the person who commissioned it or their image. The stela was acquired in Luxor over 125 years ago, and while it may have originally come from Karnak Temple, other possibilities exist, including Min's cult center at Achaemon or Koptos, both of which were also associated with this deity, as Kawai has noted, the first duty of any new pharaoh, from the earliest times, was to ensure the proper burial of his predecessor, complete with all required rituals. In the case of King Tutankhaten, who is still a child, it is clear that others would have overseen these responsibilities on his behalf. All surviving funerary equipment, originally made for the reigning queen, was later found in Tutankhamun's tomb, with the inscriptions altered to replace her name with his. This strongly suggests that she was never given a full royal burial. Seal impressions bearing the throne name Nebkepetutankhaten's royal title were discovered in tomb KV 55 in the Valley of the Kings. This tomb held the remains of a man whom Hawass and his team identified as the young king's father. These sealings linked Tutankhaten to the burial. The question remains, however, do these seal impressions indicate that Tutankhaten, even if only nominally, oversaw this man's funeral and burial at Western Thebes, as would be expected of a successor? Egyptologists have proposed alternative explanations. For instance, Dudson, who identifies the deceased as Smenkhare. Akhenaten's Corrigant believes that the burial originally took place at Tel El Amarna, under Akhenaten. According to this view, the seal impressions would then mark the later relocation of the body and burial goods from Amarna to the Valley of the Kings, sometime after Tutankhamun had changed his name. Since the impressions bear only his throne name, Nebkepper, which remained unchanged after he replaced Aten with Amen in his personal name, it is not possible to determine when during his reign this activity occurred. If Tutankhamun's predecessor had a funerary temple at Thebes as evidence, suggests then their intended burial site was likely the Valley of the Kings rather than the royal wadi at Amarna. Even those Egyptologists who consider the ruling queen to have been Tutankhaten's immediate predecessor, whether or not she was Nefertiti, generally agree with Dodson that the man buried in KV 55 was first laid to rest elsewhere. Later, during Tutankhaten's reign, the body was transferred to KV 55, which would explain the presence of seal impressions bearing his throne name. At present, this explanation seems to be the most reasonable. Even though the identity of Tutankhaten's immediate predecessor remains uncertain, there is strong evidence that a return to traditional religious practices was already underway when Tutankhamun took the throne. The funerary equipment commissioned by the reigning queen for her own burial, along with the establishment of a funerary temple by one of Akhenaten's immediate successors at Thebes, both indicate that conventional funerary beliefs were once again being honored and that the official worship of Ammon had resumed. Akhenaten's newly established capital in Middle Egypt served not only as the royal residence, but also replaced Thebes as the spiritual heart of the royal family's religious life in the south. Nevertheless, Memphis, where a temple dedicated to Aten had been constructed, continued to function as a key administrative center during the Amarna period, while some sources still place the abandonment of Tel El Amarna into fourth regnal year. It is now understood that the city remained occupied beyond that point, even into the reign of his second successor, Horemhab. However, the current scholarly consensus increasingly favors an earlier date for the royal court's departure, likely at the very beginning of Tutankhamun's reign. In fact, following Gabold's line of reasoning, it now appears probable that Tutankhamun never actually ruled from Tel El Amarna. Interestingly, there may have been uncertainty at the time about whether the departure would be permanent. Excavations conducted before the Second World War by the Egypt Exploration Society uncovered doorways in several official and private buildings that had been deliberately sealed, possibly in anticipation of future reuse. To date, the majority of small artifacts discovered at Tel El Amarna that are associated with Tutankhamun as faience ring bezels and molds used to make them bear his throne name, Nebkheper, rather than his personal name. On the rare items that do include his nomen, he is referred to as Tutankhamun. Not a single piece of evidence bearing the name Tutankhamun has yet been found at the site,